Dr. Damian Holt never imagined that saving lives would teach her how to destroy them. The emergency room physician had spent 8 years pulling people back from death's door. But tonight, as she stared at the unconscious drunk driver who had killed a family of 4, something dark awakened inside her chest. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Damian worked methodically on the patient's injuries. Her hands moved with practiced precision, suturing wounds and stabilizing vitals, while her mind wandered to places it had never been before. The man's wallet had fallen from his pocket, revealing photos of his own children smiling innocently at birthday parties and school events. How could someone destroy other children's futures while treasuring their own? "Doctor, his BP is dropping," announced Sarah, the night nurse who'd worked alongside Damian for 3 years. Sarah's voice carried the familiar urgency of their profession, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, Damian found herself calculating how long she could delay treatment without anyone noticing. The thought terrified her. Damian had always prided herself on being one of the good ones. She'd chosen medicine to heal, to serve, to make the world better. Her colleagues respected her. Her patients trusted her, and her younger sister Maya looked up to her as a role model. She donated to charity, volunteered at free clinics, and had never even cheated on a test in medical school. Yet here she stood, considering letting a man die not from medical complications, but from her own moral judgment. "Doctor," Sarah's voice cut through her internal battle. "Should I prep more plasma?" Damian blinked, refocusing on the monitor displaying the patient's vitals. His heart rate was erratic, blood pressure critical. She had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision that would define who she really was. The weight of that moment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. "Yes, prep the plasma," she heard herself say, though part of her screamed in protest, "and call surgery. We need to move fast." As the trauma team sprang into action around her, Damian caught her reflection in the metal cabinet door. The face staring back looked like hers, but something fundamental had shifted behind her brown eyes. She'd crossed a line tonight, even if she'd ultimately stepped back. The mere fact that she'd considered playing God with a patient's life revealed a darkness she never knew existed within her. The drunk driver survived the surgery. Damian stood in the hallway afterward, still wearing her scrubs stained with his blood, watching through the window as he breathed steadily on life support. He'd wake up tomorrow to face manslaughter charges, while 4 coffins would be lowered into the ground by week's end. The injustice of it burned in her throat like acid. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Saw the news about the accident. Bet you're saving lives right now. You're my hero, sis." Damian stared at the message until the words blurred. Hero. The word felt like mockery now. Heroes didn't fantasize about letting people die. Heroes didn't weigh the value of one life against another and find it lacking. Heroes certainly didn't feel disappointed when they chose to do the right thing. Dr. Patricia Chen, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, appeared beside her in the hallway. Patricia and Damian had been friends since their residency days, bonding over late-night coffee runs and shared frustrations with hospital bureaucracy. But Patricia's presence now felt like an intrusion into Damian's darkest moment. "Rough night?" Patricia asked, her voice gentle but probing. She had that therapist's way of asking simple questions that demanded complex answers. "Just another day in paradise," Damian replied, forcing a smile that felt like wearing a mask. "You know how it is." Patricia studied her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "The drunk driver case. That's got to be tough, especially after what happened to your parents." The mention of her parents' car accident 5 years ago hit Damian like a physical blow. She'd become a doctor partly because of that night, when another drunk driver had stolen her parents from her and Maya. The parallel was too obvious, too painful, too perfectly designed to test every principle she'd built her life around. "I'm fine," Damian lied, but her voice cracked on the second word. "Really, I'm handling it." Patricia nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced. "My door's always open if you need to talk." Sometimes the hardest cases are the ones that hit closest to home. After Patricia left, Damian remained in the hallway until her shift ended at dawn. She drove home through empty streets, past the intersection where the accident had occurred hours earlier. Skid marks still scarred the asphalt, and flowers were already beginning to pile up on the sidewalk. 4 lives reduced to cellophane-wrapped bouquets and teddy bears. In her apartment, Damian stood under a scalding shower until the hot water ran cold, trying to wash away the feeling that something essential had changed inside her. But the darkness remained, coiled in her chest like a sleeping snake. She'd always believed that good people were fundamentally different from bad people, that moral character was fixed and reliable. Tonight had shattered that belief. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Damian's last conscious thought was a question that would haunt her dreams. If someone as dedicated to helping others as she was could contemplate murder, what did that say about the nature of evil itself? And more terrifyingly, what other lines might she be willing to cross when pushed far enough? The answer would come sooner than she expected. 3 weeks after the accident, Damian found herself volunteering for the night shifts no one else wanted. The darkness outside matched the thoughts that had been growing stronger since that terrible evening, and she told herself that staying busy would keep the whispers in her head at bay. She was wrong. The emergency room had become her laboratory for studying human behavior. Each patient who arrived became a case study in moral worth, and Damian caught herself making calculations she'd never made before. The homeless addict who overdosed for the 3rd time that month received slower treatment than the college student injured in a climbing accident. The difference was subtle, unnoticeable to anyone else, but Damian felt it like a poison spreading through her veins. "You're working too much," Maya said during their weekly dinner at their childhood favorite diner. At 24, Maya still had the optimistic brightness that Damian remembered having once upon a time. Her sister's social work degree hung on her apartment wall next to photos of the underprivileged kids she mentored. Another reminder of the person Damian used to be. "Someone has to take care of people," Damian replied, cutting her steak with more force than necessary. The irony of her words wasn't lost on her. considering she'd spent the previous night debating whether a repeat drunk driving offender deserved the same level of care as other patients. Maya leaned forward, concern creasing her brow. "But who's taking care of you? You look exhausted, and you seem so angry lately." "This isn't like you, Damian." The observation hit too close to home. Damian forced another smile, this one feeling more natural with practice. "I'm just tired." The hospital's been understaffed since Dr. Rodriguez left for that position in Denver. But Maya wasn't convinced, and neither was Dr. Patricia Chun, who'd been watching Damian with increasing worry. Patricia cornered her in the break room during a rare quiet moment on Thursday evening, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "We need to talk," Patricia said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from Damian. "And before you say you're fine, I've been watching you for weeks. Your patient interaction scores have dropped. You're taking on dangerous caseloads, and 3 different nurses have mentioned that you seem different." Damian's coffee cup trembled slightly in her hands. "Different how?" "Colder, more detached. Like you're conducting experiments instead of treating patients." Patricia's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years studying the human mind. "What happened that night with the drunk driver?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Damian could lie, deflect, make excuses. Instead, she found herself telling the truth for the first time in weeks. "I wanted him to die," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I stood there calculating how long I could delay treatment before it became obviously negligent. I wanted him to pay for what he'd done to that family." Patricia's expression didn't change, but Damian saw something flicker in her eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or fear. "Those thoughts don't make you evil, Damian. They make you human. The fact that you're troubled by them proves you're still the person I've known for years." "But what if I'm not?" Damian's voice broke. "What if that night just revealed who I really am underneath all the medical school ethics and professional codes? What if the only thing standing between me and becoming a monster is a thin line I've already started crossing?" Patricia reached across the table, covering Damian's hand with her own. "Evil isn't something you become overnight. It's a series of small choices, compromises, justifications. The fact that you're questioning yourself means you haven't crossed any lines that can't be uncrossed." But even as Patricia spoke, Damian knew her friend was wrong. The lines were already blurring, and each shift brought new temptations to test her moral boundaries. Just last week, she'd accidentally delayed pain medication for a domestic abuser while fast-tracking treatment for his victim. The week before, she'd provided minimal care to a suspected child molester, telling herself it was medical prioritization rather than personal judgment. "I keep thinking about the Stanford Prison Experiment," Damian said suddenly. "How quickly ordinary people turned cruel when given power over others. What does it say about human nature that we're all just one bad situation away from becoming the villains in someone else's story?" Patricia's grip tightened on her hand. "It says that recognizing our capacity for darkness is the first step to preventing it from taking control. The guards in that experiment stopped seeing their prisoners as human beings. You're still fighting to see the humanity in your patients, even the ones who've done terrible things. After their conversation, Damian drove home through the city streets, Patricia's words echoing in her mind. But the comfort they were meant to provide felt hollow, because Patricia didn't know about the small cruelties, the subtle delays, the way Damian had begun sorting her patients into categories of deserving and undeserving. That night, unable to sleep, Damian found herself researching the psychology of evil online. She read about ordinary people who'd committed extraordinary atrocities, about the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, about the dangerous allure of playing judge and jury. Each article felt like reading her own psychological profile. The next morning brought a case that would test every principle she had left. A teenage gang member arrived with a gunshot wound, the same age as one of Maya's mentees. As Damian worked to save his life, she discovered a photo in his wallet of a little girl who looked exactly like the 6-year-old victim he'd killed in a drive-by shooting 3 months earlier. Standing over his unconscious form, Damian felt the familiar calculation begin in her mind. This time, the whispers were louder, more persuasive. This time, she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist them. And for the first time since that night 3 weeks ago, she wondered if she really wanted to. The darkness was winning, and Damian was running out of light to fight it. The teenage gang member's name was Marcus Rivera, and he died on Damian's table at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November. Officially, it was due to complications from his gunshot wound and massive blood loss. Unofficially, Damian had delayed his transfusion by exactly 4 minutes while she checked his criminal record on her phone. 4 minutes. That's all it took to cross the line from healer to killer. The weight of that decision should have crushed her, but instead, Damian felt a strange sense of clarity. Marcus would never hurt another child, never destroy another family. She'd prevented future victims by making one choice, and the world was arguably a better place for it. The rationalization came so easily that it terrified her more than the act itself. Time of death, 3:47 a.m. She announced to the trauma team, her voice steady. The nurses nodded grimly, accustomed to losing patients despite their best efforts. None of them suspected that their respected colleague had just committed murder. Dr. Patricia Chun arrived 20 minutes later for her early morning rounds and found Damian sitting in the break room, staring at her hands. Patricia had been conducting informal therapy sessions with Damian over the past month, trying to help her process the psychological trauma of treating violent criminals while maintaining her professional ethics. "Rough night?" Patricia asked, settling into her usual chair. The question had become their ritual, a gentle opening for Damian to share her struggles. "We lost a patient," Damian replied, testing the words on her tongue. They felt simultaneously true and false, like a statement balanced on the edge of deception. "The shooting victim?" "I heard it was touch and go." Patricia's voice carried professional sympathy, mixed with personal concern for her friend's well-being. Damian nodded, studying Patricia's face for any sign of suspicion. Sometimes we do everything we can, and it's still not enough. The lie slipped out so smoothly that Damian almost believed it herself. But beneath the surface, she felt something fundamental shifting in her relationship with truth, with right and wrong, with the very foundations of who she'd thought she was. The good Dr. Damian Holt was disappearing, replaced by someone who could kill and rationalize it within the same breath. Over the following weeks, Damian found herself researching her patients' backgrounds with increasing frequency. Social media profiles, criminal records, court documents, news articles became her bedtime reading. She told herself she was trying to understand the psychology of her patients better, but the real reason was darker. She was building cases for who deserved to live and who didn't. Maya noticed the change during their regular dinner date in December. Her sister's face had grown sharper, her eyes more calculating, her smile more practiced than genuine. "You're scaring me," Maya said halfway through their meal, setting down her fork with deliberate care. "I know something happened to you, something you're not telling me. You look at people differently now, like you're judging them." The observation hit Damian like a physical blow. If Maya could see the change, how long before others noticed? How long before Patricia realized that her therapy sessions weren't helping, but were actually providing Damian with better ways to justify her actions? "I'm seeing the world more clearly," Damian replied, the words coming from a place she didn't recognize in herself. "You work with disadvantaged kids, right? How many of them are going to grow up to hurt innocent people? How many chances do we give people before we accept that some individuals are just broken beyond repair?" Maya's face went pale. "Those kids are children, Damian. They deserve hope, support, opportunities to change their lives. And what about when they grow up? What about when one of your success stories puts a bullet in some other child's head?" Damian's voice carried a coldness that made Maya flinch. "At what point do we stop pretending that everyone can be saved?" The conversation ended with Maya leaving early, tears in her eyes and fear in her voice as she begged Damian to get help. But help required admitting there was a problem, and Damian had begun to see her new perspective not as sickness but as evolution. She was becoming someone who could make the hard choices that others were too weak or naive to make. The hospital became her hunting ground. A repeat domestic abuser died from an allergic reaction that Damian could have prevented with an epinephrine injection. A drug dealer who sold to middle school children succumbed to sepsis that progressed unusually quickly under her care. Each death was medically plausible, professionally defensible, and morally satisfying. Dr. Patricia Chun began to suspect something was wrong when she noticed the statistical anomaly in Damian's patient outcomes. Certain types of patients, those with violent criminal histories or multiple offenses, seemed to have significantly higher mortality rates under Damian's care than hospital averages would predict. "We need to talk," Patricia said, cornering Damian in the parking garage after her shift one cold January evening. The underground space echoed with their voices, creating an appropriate atmosphere for the confrontation that had been building for months. About what? Damian asked, though she knew exactly what Patricia had discovered. The game was nearly over, and part of her felt relieved. About the patterns in your patient outcomes. About the way you've changed. About what I think you've been doing. Patricia's voice shook with the weight of her suspicions. Please tell me I'm wrong, Damian. Please tell me you haven't been playing God with people's lives. Damian looked at her oldest friend, the woman who'd tried so hard to save her from the darkness, and felt something like pity. Patricia still believed in the fundamental goodness of people, still thought that everyone deserved redemption. She hadn't yet learned what Damian now knew with crystal clarity. What if I told you that I've prevented more suffering in the past 3 months than you've prevented in your entire career as a therapist? Damian asked, her voice eerily calm. What if I told you that every person I've lost was going to hurt innocent people? Patricia's face crumbled as her worst fears were confirmed. Oh, Damian, what have you done? The investigation began on a rainy Tuesday in February when Dr. Patricia Chun walked into the hospital administrator's office with a thick folder of evidence. Patient charts, statistical analyses, and timeline correlations painted a picture that no one wanted to believe, but no one could ignore. Dr. Damian Holt, the respected emergency room physician who'd saved countless lives over 8 years, had become something else entirely. Within hours, Damian found herself suspended pending a formal investigation. She cleaned out her locker methodically, placing her stethoscope and medical journals into a cardboard box that felt like a coffin for her former life. The other staff members avoided eye contact, whispers following her through corridors she'd once walked with pride. Maya was waiting in the hospital parking lot, her face streaked with tears and disbelief. The police had already been to her apartment, asking questions about her sister's behavior and mental state. The fantasy that Damian could keep her actions secret had finally shattered against the reality of Patricia's investigation. The vials were in her hands now, cold glass containing enough poison to turn the hospital into a tomb. All she had to do was connect them to the ventilation system, and within an hour, everyone would be dead. Patients, visitors, staff, they'd all simply go to sleep and never wake up. It would be beautiful in its simplicity, peaceful, painless, almost merciful. 43 minutes. Damian made her way to the mechanical room, the stolen master keycard sliding smoothly into the lock. The ventilation controls were exactly where she'd memorized them during her reconnaissance missions over the past month. A few simple connections, a timer mechanism, and her work would be done. She was reaching for the first valve when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Maya's voice, asking a nurse for directions to the emergency department. Getting closer. Getting closer. She's right down here, honey. Dr. Holt's been working such long hours lately. I'm sure she'd be thrilled to see you. Damian's sister was less than 50 feet away, carrying coffee and hope and faith in the goodness of people. In 30 seconds, she'd round the corner and see Damian connecting death to the hospital's lungs. This was the moment, the final test. The ultimate choice between the sister who still believed in her and the world that had made her into a monster. What happened next would determine whether Dr. Damian Holt died as a killer of 13 or as the architect of the greatest hospital massacre in American history. And the clock was still ticking, 42 minutes and counting. Maya staggered backward as if she'd been physically struck. "You took an oath, Damian. You swore to do no harm. And what about the harm they would have caused?" Damian's voice carried a chilling certainty that made Maya wrap her arms around herself. What about the children they would have killed, the families they would have destroyed? Sometimes preventing harm requires causing it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Sarah Martinez, whose own daughter had been treated by Damian 2 years earlier for a broken arm. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Damian had genuinely saved the child who would now watch her mother arrest the woman who'd healed her. "Dr. Damian Holt, you're under arrest for suspected murder in the first degree," Detective Martinez said, her voice professional despite the personal connection. "You have the right to remain silent, ... As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Damian felt an unexpected sense of peace. The pretending was over, the careful calculations and secret justifications no longer necessary. She'd become exactly what the world needed. Someone willing to make the impossible choices that others were too weak to make. The trial became a media sensation, dubbed the Angel of Death case by reporters who couldn't understand how someone dedicated to saving lives could systematically end them. Damon's defense attorney argued temporary insanity brought on by trauma and overwork, but Damian refused to play the victim. During her testimony, she spoke with calm clarity about her actions and motivations. The Stanford Prison Experiment showed us that ordinary people can become cruel when given power over others. She told the packed courtroom, "But what if that cruelty serves a purpose? What if some people deserve that treatment? I didn't become evil overnight. I evolved into someone who could see the world as it really is and act accordingly." Patricia Chun testified as a prosecution witness, her voice shaking as she described watching her friend's transformation from compassionate healer to calculating killer. "Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and a pitchfork," she said, looking directly at Damian. "It convinces us that our worst impulses are actually moral imperatives. It makes us believe that we're the heroes of our own stories, even when we've become the villains in everyone else's." Maya's victim impact statement broke hearts throughout the courtroom. She spoke about losing not just her sister, but her faith in the fundamental goodness of people she trusted. "Damian was my hero," she sobbed. "She saved lives, helped people, made the world better. If someone like her can become a killer, what does that say about any of us? How do we know where the line is if she couldn't see it?" The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder. As the judge pronounced a life sentence without the possibility of parole, Damian showed no emotion. She'd known this moment would come from the first night she'd delayed treatment for the drunk driver. In her final statement to the court, Damian looked out at the gallery filled with families of her victims, fellow medical professionals, and strangers fascinated by her case. The Stanford Prison Experiment taught us that good people can do terrible things under the right circumstances. But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe the terrible things I did were actually good. And the only tragedy is that no one else has the courage to make the same choices I made. As she was led away in shackles, Damian caught Maya's eye one last time. Her sister's face showed a mixture of love, horror, and something else that Damian recognized from her own journey into darkness. Maya was beginning to understand, beginning to see the world through her sister's eyes. The psychology of evil wasn't just about how good people become bad. It was about how easily our definitions of good and bad could be twisted to justify anything. Years later, in her prison cell, Damian would receive letters from people who understood her actions, who saw her not as a killer, but as someone who'd had the courage to do what needed to be done. The seeds of her philosophy continued to spread, proving that evil's most dangerous power wasn't in its cruelty, but in its ability to convince us that cruelty was actually kindness. The line between good and evil wasn't as clear as anyone wanted to believe. And Damian Holt had proven that the most dangerous monsters were the ones who genuinely believed they were heroes. Want to dive deeper into the dark psychology of human behavior? Subscribe now for more chilling stories that explore why good people do terrible things. Share this story if it made you question what you do in impossible situations, and comment below. Where do you think the line between good and evil really lies? Hit that notification bell because next week we're exploring another shocking case that proves evil doesn't look like what you'd expect. Your engagement helps us bring you more of these psychological thrillers that examine the darkest corners of human nature.